And I am Jim McAdams, and on behalf of the Mendoza School of Business and the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, I'm really thrilled to welcome our distinguished guest and his wife Finola to Notre Dame. Ambassador John Bruton is the current head of the European Union delegation in the United States. He is also a former Taoiseach, Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland. He received his early education at Clongowes College, an independent Jesuit-run secondary school. Some of you know Jesuit-run secondary schools. That counts author James Joyce among its former students. He studied for his Bachelor of Arts at the University College Dublin. He later qualified as a barrister at King's Inns, but he never went on to practice law, unlike some of you. Instead, he was elected at the ripe age of 22 to the Irish Parliament, the Dáil. At the next general election, he more than doubled his vote and brought his party, Fine Gael, to power as part of a national coalition with the Labour Party. Ambassador Bruton served in a number of junior and senior ministry positions while in Parliament, and in fact many ministerial positions. And in 1990 was elected the party leader of Fine Gael. Over the next few years, he used his political experience to rebuild the party. And when the government collapsed in 1994, he formed the Rainbow Coalition government with the Labour Party and the Democratic Left Party, thus becoming the 9th and then youngest Prime Minister in Irish history. While Prime Minister, he presided over a successful Irish European Union presidency. He helped to finalize the pact to govern the management of the euro as the single European currency, and he represented the EU at many meetings across the world. Most prominently, he helped to transform the Irish economy into the Celtic tiger, which many of you know about, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Finally, he was deeply involved in the peace processes that led to the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Today, Ambassador Bruton will speak with us about the future of economic and political relations between the European Union and the United States. I want to give a hearty Irish welcome to Ambassador Bruton.
First of all, I want to start by thanking Jim on his brilliant pronunciation of the Irish language. He's obviously been taking lessons in the Nocton Kyo Centre. His Irish is really good. I wonder, is there anybody here who has a birthday next Sunday? Nobody prepared to admit to that? No. Well, anyway, if there was somebody here who had a birthday next Sunday, they would be sharing a birthday with the European Union. Because on next Sunday, the 25th of March, the European Union will be 50 years in existence. And I'm delighted that I'm able to celebrate that event for the European Union, whom I now represent, by coming to this little part of Ireland in the middle of the United States. It's my first visit to Notre Dame. As I was saying earlier to some people I met here, that from the very first moment I came to the United States back in 1970 on a visit when I was very recently elected to Parliament, to the Dáil, people were saying, well, have you been to Notre Dame? Have you not been to Notre Dame? As if really one hadn't visited the United States of America at all unless you'd been to Notre Dame. Well, now I'm here, and I feel that the next part of my life, the remainder of my life, is going to be a much richer experience for the fact that I've been here now, and I'll hopefully come back. Anyway, what I'm here to talk to you about is the European Union. What it is, what it does, what it doesn't do, why it matters to Indiana, why it matters to the United States, and what are some of the things that we Europeans and Americans need to do together to make the world a safer and a better place for you and for your children in their time. First of all, I want to say that the European Union is the only multinational democracy in the world. We have the United Nations, but there's no Parliament of the United Nations. You can't vote for the Secretary General of the United Nations. There's no direct election for the people that run the United Nations. We have the World Trade Organization. It does very important work. But it's a diplomatic organization too, like the United Nations. Its work, its decisions are negotiated frequently in secret between diplomats and ministers, but there's no direct participation of the people through directly elected representatives in the World Trade Organization, in the World Health Organization, in the World Patent Organization, in the World Organization dealing with education, UNESCO, and so forth. There's only one organization, multinational organization, consisting in this instance of 27 nations, where the people directly elect the parliament that jointly make the decisions that govern that area. And the 27 nations of the European Union have, each of them, every 5 years, an election in which they elect the members of the European Parliament. And when European Union legislation comes to be made, it's proposed by the European Commission, which is a bit like the administration here. In fact, in Europe, only the administration may propose legislation. Individual members of Parliament can't do it. But whenever legislation is proposed by the European Commission, which is the equivalent of the US administration, that legislation, which will apply to 27 member states, has to be passed by two bodies. It has to be passed by the Council of Ministers, which represents 27 ministers representing 27 countries. But also it has to be passed by the Parliament, the European Parliament, with over 700 members, every one of whom have been directly elected by the people of Europe in proportion to the population in each part of Europe from which those members come. So we have a parliamentary democracy governing 27 countries. It's something without precedent in world history, and it is proving to be a very, very good model, and a very attractive model, which many, many countries, other countries, want to join. In this decade, since 2004, the European Union has increased its membership by 12 countries. We've gone from having 15 countries on the 31st of December 2003 to having 27 members on the 1st of January 2007. We've almost increased our entire membership, our entire population, to 500 million people, making us about twice the size of the United States in terms of population. And that has been done with the unanimous agreement of all the existing members. And to illustrate to an American audience what the enlargement of the European Union means, it would be probably good to take a parallel here in North America. What we have done would be similar to what you would have done if, in the last 4 years, each one of the 50 states of the United States, from Hawaii to Vermont, had each individually agreed that they would merge with the 32 states of the Estados Unidos de Mexico, and you now had, instead of 100 senators meeting either in Washington or somewhere else like that, you had 164 senators, of whom 64 were Spanish-speaking, representing each of them, two of them Mexican states. And the administration had to be adjusted, and lots of people who held important positions in the administration of the United States would have to lose their jobs to make room for Mexicans, and lots of Mexicans who had important jobs in Mexico City would have to lose their jobs to make way for United States citizens. And the voting power of any individual state in the United States was reduced, because instead of being one of 50, you were now one of 82 states. And as a result of that, there was a commitment that everybody from Chiapas in the south of Mexico would be entitled to seek a job in any one of the 50 states of the United States, as well as in the other 31 states of Mexico. And any American from the state of Indiana had, as of right, the ability to go and take a job anywhere in Mexico. That's what we've agreed to in creating the European Union. We've created a political union which has expanded with the unanimous agreement of each of its member states at every stage. We expanded from 6 members to 10, to 12, to 15, and now to 27. And at every stage, every one of the existing members had to agree to the additional members coming in. And if at this stage, for example, there was a question of the European Union, say, in addition to the huge expansion that we've already undertaken, that we decided that we were going to bring Turkey into the European Union. Not only would that mean that every Turkish citizen would be entitled to work anywhere they wanted in the European Union, but it would mean that they would have a huge voting bloc within the European Union, and the voting bloc of all the other countries would be reduced. But it would also mean that every Turk would be entitled to work everywhere they wanted in the European Union. But for that to happen, every one of the existing members would have to agree. And if Malta said no, it wouldn't happen. If Cyprus said no, it wouldn't happen. So it's really quite an amazing political feat when you think about it, that we've been able to get so far and do so much at every stage with the full agreement of every one of the existing members. There was no dog-in-the-manger attitude being taken here at all by the existing members. What does being in the European Union mean for a country that joins it? Well, a country that joins the European Union has to pass somewhere in the region of 80,000 pages of legislation. That's what we call the acquis communautaire, which is the sort of acquired community law. It covers everything from respect for contracts to the way in which you regulate the environment, to the way in which you regulate workers' safety. Because obviously, if we're going to have a common market where people can sell, as we do, a common market where people can sell goods freely from one country to the other, that wouldn't work if one country could sell their goods cheaply because they had no environmental standards at all, or they put their workers at risk. So we have minimum standards on all sorts of issues that countries must apply if they're to join the European Union. But in addition to that, they must have a system of courts where everybody is equal before the law. And where if you're a Bulgarian citizen complaining about something that a French businessman with whom you've been doing business in France has done to you, and you appear before the French courts, you have exactly the same chance of winning the case as the Frenchman if the law is on your side. So we insist on the rule of law in an impartial fashion being an absolute requirement for joining the European Union and getting all the benefits that go with being a member of the Union. We also insist that a country is a democracy. We don't do dictatorships. Only democratic countries may join. And we have a provision whereby countries may be thrown out if they cease to be democracies or if they cease to respect human rights. For example, we don't permit the death penalty in the European Union. If a country has the death penalty and they want to join the European Union, they have to abolish it. Because we regard the death penalty as inhuman and not in accordance with what we regard as proper standards of legal behaviour. So it's more than just a sort of an economic pact. It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values. And what we're doing, in effect, is harnessing economics, because countries, many of them, want to join the European Union because they're a little bit poorer than other countries, and they know that one way that they can get a little bit richer is by being able to sell to a bigger market. One way they can attract American companies to invest in their country is by saying, well, if you invest here, you won't just be able to sell to our market, but you'll be able to sell to all 500 million Europeans as of right. And not only that, that's not just a concession that we enjoy But we are members of the club, and we make the rules which guarantee how that market will operate. So being a member of the European Union is very attractive economically. My country, Ireland, would never have transformed itself if it wasn't for the access to this huge market that the European Union has given us, if it were not for the very large amount of money that Germans and others have given us through the European Union to enable us to build up our economy. We'd never have attracted all that foreign investment from the United States if it hadn't been for that. So joining the European Union is a very attractive thing economically. But we're using the economic attraction to achieve a political goal. And that political goal is human rights, democracy, the rule of law, and an end to conflict. An end to conflict. And that, in a way, is where the European Union began. Europe had a very special experience of war. We've probably started more wars in which more of your fellow citizens have died than any other part of the world has done. European Union countries were where the First World War started and where the Second World War started. The two greatest wars in human history had their origin, you could say, broadly speaking, at least they started as a result of a conflict between two countries, just two, France and Germany. Now, after the third of these wars, in the early 1950s, the Germans and the French decided that they'd had enough and that we'd had enough, and that they had to do something to make sure that Germany and France would be so intertwined with one another economically and physically and psychologically that they could never fight with one another again. So that's what they did in the first place by merging their coal and steel industries, merging the instruments of war, if you like, which those industries were at that time, but also creating a single market where people could move and work and live and sell, and creating an authority in which each of the countries agreed that they could be overruled by a majority of other countries within the European Union. So we've created, in addition to a union of human rights, a union of free economic movement and respect for property, we've also created a union to eliminate conflict between countries. And that's what, in essence, the European Union is, and that's what whoever it is has a birthday but won't admit to it next Sunday will be celebrating as well, I hope, as their own birthday. Just to explain how the European Union works, what it does and what it doesn't do. Well, there's sort of three pillars or three areas of work that are involved in the European Union. The first part of the work is the common market, what you'd call in this country interstate commerce. So we make rules on standards for goods, standards for services, mutual recognition of one another's standards and so forth, environmental standards. All of that work is done by a majority voting system within the Council of Ministers, and it is what we call the central competence of the European Union. The second area of work that we do is called the second pillar, and it's to do with foreign policy. Now, while we have majority voting in the Council of Ministers on the first set of work, the sort of interstate commerce type work, which is what creates the common market, when it comes to foreign policy, obviously, one of the instruments of foreign policy is your army, and no European country has yet been willing to say that they're going to hand over their army to be ordered about by anybody unless they agree. So in the matter of foreign policy, all decisions that we make are made by unanimous agreement. All 27 countries must agree before there's a common EU foreign policy. But we've got a long way in getting common positions on issues like the Middle East, even though it has to be done unanimously, because the European ministers are meeting every week. They know one another very well. We all feel part of a club. We know that together, Germany and France and all the rest of us can do a lot. Separately, we can do very little. Together, we can have some influence in Washington, some influence in Moscow, some influence in Darfur, some influence in China, but separately, other countries will simply play one of us off against the other. So there's a strong tendency, even though we have to arrive at our common foreign policy positions by unanimity, there's a strong tendency towards actually getting agreement. And the third area is to deal with cross-border crime. Why would the European Union be involved in crime? Wouldn't you think that, issues about penalties for drug offences, you could effectively leave that to the states? I mean, this country very often depends on which judicial district you're in, whether you have a chance of getting a very long or a very short sentence because of differences in policy. Well, we've come to the view that if you have a common market for goods and services, a common space in which the internet can operate to allow people to buy and sell, a common financial area in which banks can provide services across borders, which we haven't yet achieved, but which we intend to achieve soon, that if you had all of those things, you've created a common market, certainly, for consumers, but you've also created a common market, a common playground for criminals. Because criminals can exploit all of those freedoms, whether it be robbing money from somebody's bank account in Finland by virtue of using a computer that's located in Norway and stashing the money away in a bank in Italy. You can have crimes committed in 3 or 4 different places, one crime with 3 or 4 different locations. And if you have different sentencing policies, if you have different policies for gathering evidence, different approaches to sharing intelligence between the 27 countries, we're at a complete disadvantage in trying to deal with cross-border crime within the European Union. So as a result of that, we've increasingly come together in this, what we call the third pillar, to have a common evidence warrant, a common arrest warrant, where people don't have to go to court twice in one country before they can be put in another country to face the court, so that we streamline our efforts against crime and ensure that Europe is not only free but secure. Those are the things, basically, those 3 categories are the 3 categories of work that the European Union does. What does the European Union not do that the United States federal government does do? Well, one thing you'll be pleased to know we don't do is we don't do taxes. We don't raise taxes. The European Union has no power to raise taxes. We get about 1 cent in every euro, 1 cent in every dollar that's generated in Europe, which is given to us by a certain formula whereby the governments hand over the money, which they have raised in taxes set by them, and we spend that at federal level. I think it's about 20 cents in every dollar here that's spent at federal level. So there's much less spent by the European Union centrally than is spent by the United States centrally, which I suppose is not surprising. The other thing we don't do is we don't borrow. The European Union isn't allowed to borrow. Sometimes I think it should be allowed to borrow a little money to give it a bit of flexibility, but we're not. We're not allowed to borrow. So our federal government, if you like, is much weaker than your federal government, and it doesn't have the power to unilaterally raise tax and doesn't have the power to borrow. And it doesn't have the power to change its own constitution. The United States, with difficulty, can change its constitution. If you get, I think it's 2/3 of the legislature in 2 sessions and 2/3 of the states. You know the formula better than I do. It's your constitution. You understand how it can be changed. We can't change our constitution at all unless every country agrees. You may well have seen that we tried to change our constitution, or our treaties, which are effectively our constitution, recently, and France and the Netherlands didn't agree. And it can't happen unless and until they do agree. It would have been enough for just one country to have said no, and the thing couldn't have gone into effect. So the European Union isn't as powerful as the United States institutionally, for the reasons that I've just given. There's another important difference between the European Union and the United States. Although there was some doubt about this in the United States for quite some time, in fact until 1861, some people argued that states could withdraw from the United States of America, and South Carolina attempted to nullify certain legislation during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and then a little later they actually tried to withdraw completely from the United States. And it could be argued on a reading of the Constitution as it then stood that they actually had the law on their side, even if they hadn't right on their side. but that was put beyond doubt by the Civil War. States may not withdraw from the United States of America. Once you're in, you stay in. That is not the case in the European Union. The European Union is based on a treaty between states, and under the normal law of treaties, any state can denounce a treaty, so long as it compensates those affected by that in an appropriate way. So if, for argument's sake, the Czech Republic wanted to withdraw from the European Union, it's free to do so. If the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland wanted to withdraw from the European Union, if it elected a government that wanted to do that, it can do so. That's another very important difference between the United States and the European Union. And it does have an important effect on what we do and what we don't do, what we can do and what we can't do. I'd now like to, having explained roughly what we are, to go on to say something about how the European Union is important to the United States and how it's important to the state of Indiana. Well, two out of every $3 that are invested in the United States by countries outside the United States are invested in the United States by countries of the European Union. 2 out of every $3. We're the biggest investor in the United States by a huge margin. You're also the biggest investor in us by a huge margin. There's more American investment in Europe than there's American investment anywhere else in the world. There's more European investment in America than there's European investment anywhere else in the world. There's more European investment in somewhere around 20 states individually than there is American investment in China. There's more European investment in California alone than there is American investment in China. There's more European investment in Texas alone than there is American investment in China. US companies make more profits in Europe than they make anywhere else. American companies make 3 times as much profits from their investments in Ireland than they do from their investments in China. Now, there are somewhere in the region of 4 million people in Ireland and somewhere over 1 billion people in China. And yet you make 3 times as much profits from what you've invested in Ireland as you do from your investments in China. And you make 5 times as much profit from your investment in the Netherlands, which is even smaller than Ireland, although it has a good number more people. They're crowded a little bit more together. You make 5 times as much profits in the Netherlands alone than you make in China. Now, what does that mean? Well, it certainly means that we're important to one another. It means that it's important that we get on. That's certainly true. But it's also important to us that you do well, and it's important to you that we do well. We're not rivals, because we own part of you. We own part of the United States. But the nice thing about it is, you own part of the European Union. So if things go badly for us, they'll go badly for you. Nobody wants to see some house property that they've invested in, suddenly go down for some reason because of bad neighbors or trouble on the street or something like that. So the United States is like a householder who's bought, a house in the next town. You've bought a big house in Europe, and you must hope that that neighborhood remains a good place to have your house. And we have the same feelings about you. Now, this needs to be explained over and over again to people in Europe, because sometimes you'll see Europeans sort of feeling sort of comfortable and a bit superior when things are going badly for the United States. And they say, yeah, I told you so. What would you expect? All that sort of stuff. Now, I'd hesitate to say it, but you sometimes have the same feeling here in the United States about what's going on in Europe. You sometimes have Americans saying, oh, Jacques Chirac has got it wrong, etc., etc. We all know about French fries and freedom fries and all that sort of stuff. Well, the truth of the matter is there are huge amounts of American money invested in France. France is one of the best investors in the United States in the world. So Americans have a vested interest in the success of France, and the same in return. So it's important, I think, to understand that. It's not just an issue of the fact that there are 14 million people employed on either side of the Atlantic in the various investments that we have in one another. It's much more than that. It's something much deeper than that. But let me get a bit more local. I was speaking to your local Congressman Joe Sweeney, yesterday in preparation for coming to South Bend. He represents South Bend, and he was recently elected to the Congress. And I felt that before I came here, I should have a word with Congressman Sweeney. And Joe Donnelly, yes, indeed, Joe Donnelly. There is no Joe. Joe Sweeney is the AFL-CIO. I got the name mixed up. Joe Donnelly. I was talking to Joe yesterday anyway, and so I asked him, did he have any message that he wanted to convey to you? So he said the message was, vote for Joe. So I don't know whether any of you are going to vote for Joe. Probably some of you did. But anyway, I did explain to Joe Donnelly yesterday something about the extent of European investment in Indiana. European firms employ 76,000 people in the state of Indiana. The European Union is the second biggest market for Indiana exports after Canada, I assume, in the world. And exports from Indiana to Europe support 116,000 jobs in this state. There's more export from Indiana. There are 7 times as much exports going from Indiana to the European Union countries as are going to Japan. 11 times as much exports going from Indiana to European countries as are going to China. 18 times as much as are going to South Korea and India. India is an immensely important country. It's an economic giant. It's going to become bigger and more important, and I think we should welcome that. But at the moment, Indiana exports 47 times as much to the European Union as it exports to India. So the European market is really important to this country. I'd now like to say that, move on from the economics to talk a little bit about the problems that we're facing in the world today. I think we face a number of problems. There are a number of significant risks to peace in the world. One of the risks that we have is the risk of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And I attended a meeting earlier this week, between Secretary of State Rice and the European equivalents of her, Commissioner Ferrero-Waldner and Mr. Javier Solana. And what came across to me from that meeting is that the European Union and the United States are working very closely together to deal with this issue of the possible proliferation of nuclear weapons to Iran or by Iran. We recognize that Iran has genuine security worries. Iran is one of the few countries in the world against whom weapons of mass destruction have actually been used in recent times when it was attacked by Iraq. Iran is surrounded by nuclear powers. It has the United States, which is a nuclear power in occupation in Iraq. It has Pakistan on the other side, which is also a nuclear power. And it has Russia to its north, which is a nuclear power. So it's not surprising in a way that Iran feels a little insecure and is looking for ways of getting some more security. And it thinks that perhaps at least threatening to get the nuclear weapon or suggesting that it might be getting the nuclear weapon, even though it denies that, but allowing people to think that, might enhance its security. Now, I don't think it does. I think it's a waste of money. But I think we Europeans recognize, and increasingly I think the US administration recognizes, that Iran has genuine fears as well, and that we must find a way of assuaging those fears. And by coming together, the United States, with its immense military power second to none in the world, and the European Union with its immense economic power and its persuasive power and its investment abilities, that Europe and America together can put together a package that would persuade the Iranians to abandon the nuclear course. That's what we're working towards, and I think we're working towards increasingly on that issue in a way that is concerted the one with the other. Another major threat to world peace is the situation as between Israel and Palestine, where since 1967, territories with a majority Arab population on the West Bank and in Gaza are under Israeli military occupation, either directly or they're surrounded by Israeli military, as is the case with Gaza. And that's not a sustainable situation. It isn't sustainable for one country to go on occupying another country indefinitely. And it's not a situation that Palestinians accept. They're finding themselves being increasingly that parts of their territory that they thought was their own is being taken over by settlements, which are not in accordance with international law, unoccupied land. When you occupy another country, you're not entitled to go in and settle other people in it in accordance with international law. But also, on the other side, you have had examples of very extreme terrorism promoted in the past by Palestinians against Israel and against innocent people in Israel. So this is one of these conflicts that creates divisions throughout the world. We believe that by working together, the United States and the European Union can provide an answer to this. At the moment, Palestinian territories effectively can't trade because they can't import or export adequately. And most of the money that's keeping people from starvation in the Palestinian territories at the moment is being provided by the taxes of the European Union. So we have some means of influencing the Palestinians. We believe the United States, which provides very substantial military and other support to Israel, has an important capacity to influence Israel. If we can work together with energy and commitment and vigor, we believe we can solve that problem. It won't be a solution that will be satisfactory to everybody. In fact, if it's be a viable solution, it probably should be satisfactory to nobody. Because if one side in that conflict is too pleased with what they've got, then somebody else has got too little. So we've got to find a way of crafting a solution that will be balanced and fair as between Israel and Palestine. And working together with our complementary capacities, I believe that the European Union and the United States can go a long way to solve that problem. The third big problem, which is not just a threat to world peace, but is a threat to humankind, that we face is the problem of climate change or global warming. I happen to have seen the Inconvenient Truth movie quite recently. Many of you will have seen it, and I'm not going to recite the various statistics that were so eloquently put before you and have not been scientifically controverted by anybody authoritative. I'm not going to go over that ground again. But I think one thing is clear, that the bulk of the greenhouse gases that are up there in the atmosphere now, that are causing problems now, haven't been put there by the Chinese. They haven't been put there by the Indians. They haven't been put there by the Africans. They haven't been put there by the South Americans. They haven't been put there by anybody other than us, the United States and Europe. We're the ones that have created this great layer of greenhouse gas. Now, we can't take it down again. We can't extract the greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. It's not possible to do that. If we could, we would, but we can't. So we've got to ensure that we stop doing more of it. Now, you could say, well, one way of doing this would be to stop the Indians and the Chinese from developing, so that they don't increase the number of cars that they have, increase the amount of home heating oil that they use, keep them poor, and we can do a little bit of conservation and that might solve the problem. You could do that. Theoretically, you could do it. But I don't think the Chinese would be too keen on that. I don't think the Indians would be too keen on it, and I think they would be right. So clearly, if there is to be leadership in this area, and if there is to be leadership, it has to be leadership not by preaching but by example, that leadership has got to come from, you guessed it, the European Union and the United States. We've got to show a lead on this. We've got to make sacrifices. We've got to sacrifice some of the things that we're enjoying today, some of the taxes that we're spending perhaps on less beneficial things, and invest them in research on new technologies that will reduce the amount of greenhouse gases we emit into the atmosphere, whether it be by making our heating of buildings more efficient, by using the car less, by having more mass transit, by building houses closer together so that you will be able to do some things at least without using the car, and also by taxing gasoline. If you tax something, people will use less of it. There's no doubt about that. I think we've got to look at all of these means of reducing the amount of damage that we do to the environment. None of it is easy. But I think we've got to commit ourselves to doing it. And the European Union has committed itself that it has already succeeded in reducing by 10% the amount of greenhouse gases we emit relative to the amount of greenhouse gases we emitted in 1990. We're now committing ourselves to reducing that by 2020 to 20% below our 1990 level. And if there is a global agreement in which everybody else is prepared to go on board, we're prepared to reduce our greenhouse gases by 2020 to 30% below our 1990 level. And we're prepared to put the measures in place to do this. But it makes not enough sense for us to do that unless others are doing the same. Because if the United States went on just running its economy on the basis of high energy use, then oil prices probably are going to fall. I think in the short term, oil prices are going to fall. So we can't rely on high oil prices to just solve the problem for us. If the United States were to decide that it was just going to ignore this problem and going to get competitive advantage for itself by letting it rip and selling its goods more cheaply because it kept its gasoline prices low and kept its heating oil prices low and was thereby able to undercut other countries on the market which were taxing these more highly and restricting their use more severely. Well, if the United States did that, it would undermine our efforts. It would undermine our efforts in two ways. It would undermine our efforts by putting more greenhouse gas up into the atmosphere than should be put there, but it would also undermine our efforts by costing us jobs. And Europeans would be coming along and saying, hey, why are you asking us to only use the bus rather than use our car? Why are you taxing our cars so heavily? Why are you taxing our heating oil so heavily? Well, the Americans are getting away with it. It wouldn't be politically sustainable, really, for us in the long run to do what we need to do unless you also do what you need to do. So that's the challenge that we have. We have the problem of maintaining world peace. We have the problem of maintaining the world. And we can only do it together. If you look at the great sweep of history, for the first 2 millennia, up to 1800, up to 60% of all the world economic activity took place in Asia, between India and China. By 1900, however, their share had gone right down to around 10%. The United States and Europe had risen to around 50 to 60%. Now, by 2000, both India and China are beginning to recover, and we're down somewhere around 40%. Now, I think, given that there's over 1 billion people in India and 1 billion people in China, and they're just as smart as we are, possibly smarter, and the technologies are all there, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper, there's no reason but to believe that they're going to expand very quickly, and that their income is going to rise. So, if you like, the period during which we, Europeans and Americans, have the steering wheel in our hands, that we are the dominant economic force in the world, and that we can set the agenda, that period is probably not going to last more than another 25 or 30 years. We've enjoyed that predominance for the last 150 years. We're probably going to have it for another 25. After that, other countries will be sharing the predominance with us. And we've got a choice. Your generation has a choice. Are we going to use our power to ensure that everybody gets the same chance that we now have to live in freedom, to live under the rule of law, and to live in a world at peace that is pursuing policies that are sustainable? We, Europeans and Americans, working together, can do more than almost any people could have done at any time in the past history to achieve that objective in the next 25 to 30 years. It's an opportunity of unprecedented proportions, and it's important that we understand one another, we understand the opportunity, and work to take it, to grasp it, and to give the sort of leadership that the world needs at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bruton. We now have time for some Q&A. It's the custom of the Nanovic Institute to begin with students, and since we have more than 10 students here, I'm sure that one or two of you can pose some really challenging questions. You, sir.
I'm wondering if there's a limit to the amount of sovereignty that European nations are going to give up. It's already been a progression in the last 50 years of moving more and more towards the world government. Is there a limit to how much?
Well, I think the important is that countries are free to leave the European Union if they really want to, and that clearly limits the amount of sovereignty that they will give up. Countries are not going to give up sovereignty that they don't see that they can use more effectively together with other countries than they can use it on their own. I think, in fact, that countries have increased their sovereignty by joining the European Union. Take an example of a small country like Lithuania. What influence has it got on global warming? What influence has it got on Russia and what Russia might do, even though it's its closest neighbour? Very little. But Lithuania, as part of a 27-member European Union, can have tremendous influence on what happens in Russia, tremendous influence on global problems of all kinds. So joining the European Union is a form of increasing sovereignty, even though it does involve a certain sacrifice of theoretical freedom.
Yes, very bad.
With respect to what you see in the press, you mentioned nuclear proliferation with Palestine, Israel, and global warming. I'm wondering, where do you see the threat of the spread of radical Islamist ideology or jihadist ideology, specifically in Europe?
It's a serious problem, but it's a problem fundamentally, I think, of a sense of loss of dignity. That people from that civilization, from that cultural background, have seen their part of the world do less well than other parts of the world for reasons that some of which have to do with internal unwillingness to have a proper civil order within their states and a lack of loyalty to their states, which are seen as sort of almost artificial creations in many instances and not ones that command the same loyalty that maybe our states command from their citizens. But also I think they see that Europeans have been interfering, as they would put it, in their part of the world. By that they mean Europeans and Americans, because we're all lumped together, really, crusaders in their minds. And that we've been interfering. And if you're given a choice, if things are going badly, of blaming one of two people, blaming someone else for something that undeniably they've done that hasn't made life easy for you, or blaming yourself, even though maybe you're a little bit more to blame yourself, you will choose to blame someone else. That's human nature. And I think there is a tendency in the Islamic world, broadly speaking, to blame the West, to blame Christians, to blame Zionists for their problems. Now, objectively, they're not wrong, but I think they exaggerate grossly. But I think what needs to be done is to find a way in which the people concerned in Islam recognize that this is not a true representation of Islam over its history, that Islam is fundamentally a religion of peace, and that the obstacles that are within the Arab world to its development can be removed by our being statesmanlike about things like the Middle East and Iraq and Iran, but also about their taking more responsibility for their own future. But it's not going to be achieved quickly. It's not going to be achieved by military methods. It's something that will take time. You don't change a mindset in 2 or 3 years. You change a mindset over a generation. And this is a fundamentally challenge of changing the way people see themselves in that part of the world. They've got to change their own self-image and have a better self-image and a better hope for the future. We can help by painting a picture for them of what that future might be. But at the end of the day, it's really they that have to paint the picture.
Follow up that question. What role do you see, or what promises, what threats do you see coming out of the huge influx of Muslims that we see in Western Europe?
I think we should a proportion. There are relatively, I'm not so sure of the proportion. I think that about 5% of the population of Europe as a whole. Now, in certain cities, you will see a much larger concentration than that. And I suppose people who haven't got you'll see them more often on the street. People who have big homes in the suburbs, you won't see them on the streets. People who have very small homes is all they can afford in the central city. They probably tend to be more visible because they're on the streets more often. So visiting a European city, you may get an impression of a much larger non-European presence than is actually statistically the case. But I think, broadly speaking, people of Turkish heritage are becoming integrated in Germany. I know a number of Turkish MPs in the German Bundestag. People of Muslim heritage are becoming integrated in France. A number of popular television announcers are people from that community. We, in my own country, have absorbed large numbers of immigrants. And I think as people go from generation to generation, they become more integrated. There is a particular problem with the second generation. I think those who come in as the first generation, very often, from any culture, this would be true of the Irish coming to America, for example. The first generation were so pleased to be in America, so pleased to have escaped starvation, that they just went on with work. The second generation, who already had provided for their material needs, started getting nostalgic and simplistic about the old country, and had all sorts of ideas about how they might help the old country by sending money over to people to plant bombs and things like that. So there is an issue with the second generation of immigrants always, who have a sort of a romantic and distorted view of the world. And I think we need to give special attention to the education of people so that they develop, without forswearing any of their heritage of their home country, that they become French, that they don't consider themselves they become French and European, but proud of their Algerian heritage, or proud of their North African heritage. That's what we must aim at. We must aim at the idea of making people comfortable with their past and their future, with their neighbours as well as with their family.
Slightly older than the European.
So am I.
I'm thinking that U.S.-European relations are at their lowest ebb in my lifetime. Putting aside causes, if I'm right, put aside the causes of that state of affairs, how optimistic are you that we can get from here to something better with regard to not only relations between the American government and European Union or European states, but also the perception of Americans in Europe? It seems to me that there's not only a divide today as there was in the 1980s between governments. But there has been, to some extent, a growing divide in European attitudes toward the American people.
I just think that that isn't the case. There are attitudes amongst the general public arising from the war in Iraq, which a majority of Europeans, though not a majority of European governments, a majority of European citizens felt was a mistaken intervention, and that it was at the very least premature, that more time could have been given. That would have been the view of a majority of Europeans, but as of now, any European who thinks seriously about it knows that our interests in Iraq are exactly the same as America's interests in Iraq. We don't want to see Iraq, sink into chaos as a result of any precipitate action or inaction by the United States having created the current situation. We have an interest in giving Iraq sufficient time to stabilize itself, just as you have an interest in that objectively. We have probably a greater interest in the sense that we're physically nearer to Iraq. If Turkey were to become a member of the European Union, we'd actually have a border with Iraq. We want to see that stabilized. As far as the issue of US and EU being close together, well, take the last 100 years. Europe was engulfed in the Great War for 3 years before the United States intervened because of problems with German submarines. The Nazis had overrun all of continental Europe. There were 2 years in occupation of all of continental Europe, from 1939 to 1941, before the United States intervened, because it was attacked by the Japanese, and Germany declared war on the United States as a result of the Japanese action. I think you could say that at that time there was quite a distance. In the period from 1900 up to December 1941, Europe and the United States were far further apart at that period of history, in every sense, than they are now. What did lead, I think, to a very intense, close, an artificially close relationship between the United States and the European countries from 1945 up to 1989 was the Soviet threat, where the Soviets had massive conventional military superiority on the continent of Europe. They could have, using conventional means alone, have reached the Atlantic within a few days because they had far more tanks than were placed in Western Europe. So we depended on the American nuclear dissuasion to keep the Soviets from doing that. So naturally, that external threat made us really close together. It was an alliance partially of fear. Now, what is really remarkable is that threat is now completely removed. And yet, I would say that on a day-to-day basis, problem by problem, we are actually working more closely together between the State Department and the European Union than was the case even during the Cold War. During the Cold War, it was a sort of an unequal relationship. We depended on the United States. That was it. It was a dependency relationship, with all the good and bad characteristics of a dependency relationship. Now the relationship is somewhat more a relationship of equals. We're not exactly equal, but I think the United States recognizes that we have something special and extra to bring to resolving the problems alongside what the United States has. So my contention is that the relationship at the level of statesmanship is very close. The difficulty, I suppose, is with public opinion. Public opinion in Europe needs to understand that it's one thing to have your opinion about history. And one is entitled to have one's opinion about whether it was historically right to have intervened in Iraq or not in circumstances. But that is history. It may be recent history, but it's history. Today is what counts. What's going to happen in Iraq tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and next year, and the year after that, and what that's going to mean for Saudi Arabia, what's that's going to mean for Iran, what's that going to mean for Turkey. That's what's really important now. And that's the subject upon which we're actually working very closely together. But the citizens of Europe don't fully realize that, I think, and don't realize how important it is for them and their security. That's a job for politicians in Europe to do.
The Constitution or the EU changes that France and the Netherlands declined. Can you maybe expound on what those changes were and if there's going to be another attempt to get changes through?
I don't think that France and the Netherlands, the public in those countries, voted against the European Union because of anything specific in the constitutional treaty at all. I think they voted against it because they were sort of felt it was being sprung on them, even though it wasn't, but it had been something that had been negotiated in public, but they weren't aware of it really because they're not, they were reading the sports pages rather than the inside pages of European learned magazines. So they weren't all that well informed about what was going on. And they felt that there already had a whole lot of change had happened in Europe, that in a few years Europe had gone from being just a cosy 6 or 10 countries in Western Europe to including 25 countries as it was at the time. And they felt, hey, we weren't consulted about this. It's all happening too fast. Stop the lights, Stop the train for a moment. Let's pull into the siding and think. Are we going in the right direction? And it was that sort of feeling of uncertainty that led them to say no. I don't think it was any objection to the content of the Constitution per se. But they did say no, so we have a problem. And that problem is how to make some important changes that need to be made in our internal working that would enable us to do our business more efficiently. I think it's not a problem. It's a very important problem, but it's not deadly urgent. The European Union is still getting along fine, doing a lot of important things on energy, on climate change, on opening up the services market. That's some things that we should have done years ago, but we're doing them now with the existing constitutional arrangements. So while it's important that we should improve that constitutional arrangement by doing the things that are in the constitutional treaty, I think we can, we shouldn't get ourselves into a sort of a psychological crisis over it, because it's work that we will find the time to do it, and people will agree to it, just if the timing is right.
Deals with Russia and EU relations, and currently I believe that a significant portion of the EU's energy sources, namely oil and gas, do come from Russia. And coupled with the fact that Bruton isn't the most democratic president, how would you see any future relations between both the EU and Russia emerging in light of these two trends?
One of the things that we've got to avoid with countries other than ourselves is taking other people for granted. And Russia may have felt at times that it was taken for granted. Russia, and is now, because it has, as you say, oil and gas that we need, it may feel that this is an opportunity to sort of remind the rest of us that Russia is a big country, that Russia deserves to be respected, that Russia shouldn't be pushed around, and that Russia's opinions on global issues should be taken really seriously. And I think there may have been a tendency, that we've gone from a point where, up to 1989, the US-Russia relationship, in a way, was the only relationship that really mattered in the world, almost, apart from the China relationship, to a sense that we, Europeans and Americans, were sort of enlarging to the east, taking countries into NATO that were right on Russia's border, and saying, well, it doesn't matter. We weren't saying that, of course, but, that sort of acting as if Russian opinions were just, not terribly important, because Russia was having all sorts of internal problems at that time. Now Russia has resolved those internal problems to a good extent by methods we mightn't particularly approve of. Gas prices have gone up, and Russia is important. And I think we've just got to recognize that. Russia is important. You've got to talk to Russia pragmatically. Doesn't mean that you should give in to Russia on things that are unreasonable, but equally we've got to talk, all of us have got to talk respectfully to Russia. And I think if we do that, I don't think Russia has any particular ambitions that are to our detriment. Russia wants to sell its gas. If we stop buying it, they'd stop getting money. So that's not something they want either. So I think it's a question just of, recognizing recognizing the realities of the situation and moving forward. I'm reasonably relaxed about it, actually.
That we'll take 3 questions and then put you in the awkward position of trying to be all over the place. Yes, first you. And well, actually, let me choose 2 other people. You and you. Those 3.
I'm afraid I haven't heard you.
I was wondering if you thought it was really wise for the United States and Europe to make the sacrifices you discussed in favor of stopping global warming, which might be detrimental to our economy and that of Europe, especially when we risk accelerating the rise of China and India as the predominant world powers.
Well, I think China and India are going to re-emerge as very important world powers one way or another. And I think we've got to reconcile ourselves with that and not take an antagonistic view towards the rise of China or the rise of India. I think if we were to do that, we'd be making a serious mistake. They have so many people. There's only 300 million Americans. There's only 500 million Europeans. There's more than 1,000 million in China alone, more than 1,000 million in India alone. We've got to accommodate ourselves to the fact that they are going to rise one way or the other. But we've got to ensure that in rising, they don't aggravate the global warming problem. There are huge areas of China that will be flooded if the sea level rises. Huge areas of India that will be flooded. Bangladesh will effectively disappear if the global warming continues. So they have just as much an interest in solving this problem as we do. So I think there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to get together with them. Sorry for jumping in. I know you wanted to take 3 questions, but I just wanted to do that.
That is holding Turkey back on inclusion into the EU. And going on to the first question, what kind of specific policies do you implement considering China and India will soon
Well, I'll take those 2. The last question was, what can we do about China and India producing more CO2? And the other question was about Turkey.
My question is, as an Irishman, as European, and then also as statesman, and this is a big one, how do you feel about Turkish accession to the European Union?
Well, as far as Turkey joining the European Union is concerned, that will require the consent of every one of the existing 27 members, maybe 28 members at the time. And the people in some countries will actually be voting on that issue according to the French constitution. The French people will have a referendum on the subject. At the moment, the negotiations with Turkey are proceeding on most issues, but there is a block of issues that we're not negotiating with the Turks on because they refuse to allow ships to dock in Turkish ports carrying the flag of one of the member states of the European Union, namely Cyprus. And we believe that one of the essences of being in the European Union is that you allow free trade between member states. And a country that wants to join the European Union on the basis of allowing free access to the European Union and from the European Union, that is simultaneously refusing an EU country, which happens to be its nearest EU neighbour, to allow its ships to dock in Turkish ports, is in a situation that isn't acceptable from our point of view. And that's why the negotiations are currently at a standstill on some of the issues, but not on other of the so-called chapters in the negotiation. At the end of the day, I think these problems will be solved. I think it's technically quite feasible to negotiate an accession agreement for Turkey. Turkey is making a lot of progress. There are some issues about human rights and religious freedom which remain to be resolved, but we've resolved more difficult issues in other countries in the past, so there's no reason why Turkey wouldn't resolve those too. I think at the end of the day, there will be this issue as I said, of the French referendum. But there will also be, and possibly an Austrian referendum too, there will also be a question, I think, as to whether the Turks themselves really want to join a European political union in which they might be, although the biggest country in it, outvoted. Will they be willing to accept that restriction? Will they be satisfied that the addition to their sovereignty that comes from being in the European Union will be sufficiently great to compensate them for the loss of sovereignty? And some opinion polls that have been done in Turkey in the recent past suggest that many Turks, unlike most other European countries, feel that being in the European Union threatens their sort of Turkish identity. Well, to my mind, if you want to be a comfortable member of the European Union, you've got to be of the view that being in the European Union doesn't threaten your identity. You've got to see that your identity as an Irish person or a French person is enhanced by also having a European identity. And so it's going to be, I think, a very important psychological decision that Turkey will itself have to make perhaps 20 years from now when the negotiation is fully completed. As far as what we can do to deal with global warming is concerned, obviously there are techniques being developed for carbon sequestration. If we can put the carbon down into the earth rather than send it up into the atmosphere. There are clean coal technologies which we must persuade the Indians and the Chinese to adopt. These are more expensive than dirty coal technologies. There are all sorts of other things that we can do in the area of renewable energies that we're not doing sufficiently at the moment. There's nuclear power. If we can find a safe way of disposing of the nuclear waste, nuclear power may provide an answer. But, of course, uranium is also in relatively short supply in the world, so we could have a problem with that eventually, too. But most importantly of all, there's cutting back, using less, maybe turning down the heating, maybe turning down the air conditioning, maybe getting the bus rather than driving somewhere, maybe living a life that's a little bit less convenient, but involves sharing your space more with other people than living a life as if it was a personal biography written in the sky about yourself as the only star. Maybe we've got to change the way in which we live.
Ambassador Bruton, I'd like to thank you for this very, very inspired presentation.
Thanks.
In addition, for both of you in your visit to Notre Dame. I also wanted to say that it is my sincere hope that the next time Bono was on the Notre Dame campus, that you and Donnelly will be here to welcome him. Thank you very much.